Over the last few weeks, Litecoin has lost a lot of ground to the rally that began at the start of November, dropping as low as 40% from the highest wick to the lowest wick. While some people might believe this signals poor price action to come in the short-term future, I'm here to tell you that there have been signals with Litecoin in the past that indicate otherwise, and this potentially could be the start of a very strong upward movement for Litecoin. In this video, we're going to explore both scenarios and using past performance, determine what could potentially happen with Litecoin, whichever way it decides to play out. If you guys like the content, please leave a like, consider subscribing too. Also, Happy New Year to all of you. This video will hopefully go out on New Year's Day. So if you are watching on New Year's Day, I hope you had a very merry New Year's Eve. And I'm sure you're watching this video with a very clear, sober, unhung-over mind. Now, like all my videos, before we talk about where Litecoin can go, I like to talk about where it has been. And just make sure that we're all on the same page. So again, like I said at the start, we've had a 40% drop over December, basically. From this peak to the low, we've dropped 40%. One thing that always stands out to me when looking at the Litecoin chart is the fact that we have, usually every cycle, we have these four very defined peaks. And we'll look at the second cycle to illustrate this. But we can see that the first peak that we get is this red one, but we'll come back to that. But the first main peak that we get is the bull run peak. This is the peak that we have after multiple months of brilliant price action. And we've seen this quite a few times with the Litecoin. The second peak that we have is after the bear run and what I like to call the minor bull run. This is the major bull run. This is the minor bull run because we rally up for a long period of time. And you know, you can make huge amounts of money here. Litecoin was $25 at the low, and it was $140 at the high. So for me, a 5x over the space of 6-7 months, I would count as a bull run. So we get major bull run, minor bull run, the peak of the minor bull run. We then get the minor bear market. And then our final two peaks that we've had every cycle is the pre-halving peak, which is, like the name suggests, a peak right before the halving, and then the post-halving peak. And I think these two peaks are basically to reduce liquidity, just to make sure that short and long sellers have a hard time. Because a lot of people think after the halving, okay, it's only up after the halving. And a lot of the time it is, to be honest with you. And a lot of people buy up before the halving. It's kind of an accumulation phase type of thing. So this is where a lot of short and long sellers get wrecked equally. And then finally, we're back to our bull run peak. And we can see that again, we got the same thing exactly in cycle 3 as we did to cycle 2. And the similarities are eerie. We have our bull run peak, kind of two smaller peaks on the way down. We can see we got these two smaller peaks on the way down with Litecoin. Then it's basically straight down to the bottom. Once we bottom out, we have a bit of a bull run. Again, very weak for Litecoin last cycle, but we get this second peak. Then we get our pre-halving peak. And then now, in my opinion, we've had the post-halving peak. And the reason I say that we've had the post-halving peak is we've dropped 40% in the space of 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And to me, that's good enough reason to say that that's a very definitive peak. Now, looking at previous post-halving peaks, we can see that the Litecoin does drop quite ferociously during this time. And we can see, like, back here, dropped 40%. Note, 40%. The exact same as what we're currently at, which is 41%. We've dropped 41% so far. Back here, we dropped 39%. So 2% isn't very different at all, in my opinion. What does look different, though, is that here, last halving, we dropped down to sort of the previous lows that we were at. We can see we came down to this $40 range. We spent a lot of time at the $40 range before the halving and after the halving. Whereas here, if we take a look at the current price action, Litecoin's had a much stronger rally. And so a 40% drop doesn't bring you anywhere near $60 low that we've been at for pre-halving and post-halving. So that's why it does look quite different. And the first reason for this is just that, again, this has been a much stronger rally. This is the first time we've seen the post-halving peak be higher than the pre-halving peak. It's also the first time we've seen the post-halving peak be higher than the minor bull run peak. And in my opinion, this is a combination of Litecoin having a very poor year, or a very poor cycle, if you'll excuse me. back from 2020 to 2024, very poor third cycle. But also, what's also interesting, and why I think this does work and that we don't have lower to go, is that if we go back to the last halving, the second halving Litecoin experience, we can see that after the pre-halving high, we dropped down quite seriously, and to this low of $25 that Litecoin bottomed out at, the low that we got after the post-halving peak. So if we measure from low to low, low after the pre-halving to low after the post-halving, we got 67% of a move, of a difference between these two lows. And if we do take a look at what we're currently at, currently we're at 72% from low to low, assuming that this is the low. Now to me, those percentages seem pretty strong. Potentially we could come down a little more. We might see this low to low, the difference might shrink even more, potentially down to like a 68. But again, that's suggesting that the lowest price Litecoin would go to realistically is about $85. I don't know if that's the case, but it's definitely possible. However, if you do just want to kind of assume that this is the low that we're in, after we put in the low, we got a green week, a few slow green weeks, about 3 or 4 weeks of more or less nothing happening, and then our bull run started. So again, if you want to assume that this is our first green week of nothing, you might want to say that we have 2 or 3 weeks. Again, it doesn't have to be the exact same, so it could be 4 weeks, could be 7 weeks, could be 1 week, but an arbitrary amount of time before we get our next bull run cycle and where we see crazy gains. In my opinion, the fact that Litecoin has actually made such a good rally in Q4 of 2024, I think that does suggest at least some hope for Litecoin. I think we'll probably return to all-time highs again, like we have basically every cycle. But potentially there could be hope for Litecoin putting in a new all-time high. Now, I know last cycle we did also put in a new all-time high, but the difference was about $20 between the all-time highs. Maybe this cycle we might see something a bit more drastic. I mean, if you want to measure things like the difference between the red and the blue top, it was 500% here. If Litecoin gets a 500% move from the red top, that's putting you somewhere around a $900 Litecoin. You know, this $900 Litecoin is crazy. That's over a 2x of the previous all-time high. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm not even saying that's a plausible outcome. But I'm just saying there are ways of measuring things that can seem like it must happen, but of course it doesn't have to. And the reason for that is I mean, if you take a look at the previous cycles, there are a lot of things that are similar, like the moves that we get, the peaks that we see. They are pretty consistent. What's not consistent with them is the amount they move up and the time period between them. We can see this first halving from the bull run peak to the minor bull run peak, we had 83 weeks. And the second cycle was pretty close to that with 78. However, this last cycle, cycle 3, it was 112 weeks from major to minor peak. Again, if we take a look at the minor to pre-halving, 50 weeks for the first cycle, 34 for the second, 39 for the third. So that's quite a big range because it's not a long period of time. If it's ranging from 50 to 35, that's quite a big discrepancy there. And again, similar enough with the pre to post, although we do know that over all of these, the time frames get shorter from each one. So here we have 83, then we're down to 50, then we're down to 28. Here we're down 78, 34, 27, 112, 40, 35. So that's one thing that is consistent. The time frames shrink between peaks. And again, the only kind of thing that I don't have measured here in terms of time is the difference from post-halving peak to bull run peak. And if we go to the first cycle, we'll take a look here quickly. Again, somewhere around 50 weeks, I think, 51 weeks for the first cycle, or second cycle, sorry, excuse me. For the third cycle, we're looking at somewhere around 40, 38 weeks. So if you want to take some kind of an average from the current peak that we're at, and we'll say 42 because that's somewhere about in the middle, 43 maybe is more technically middle, that gives you a peak of end of September, October time, basically beginning of Q4 when we're going to peak out. Whether that's what you believe or not is up to you. It doesn't coincide generally with when we've peaked during bull runs previously, although Last cycle we did get August, September peak with Bitcoin and a few other altcoins. Litecoin didn't get that strong move up like Bitcoin did. But again, that's the whole point. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. It's that you can only draw so much from the past because there's always going to be differences from cycle to cycle. Cycle 1 was 160 weeks here from blue to red. Cycle 2 was 139 from blue to red. And cycle 3 here from blue to red, the red that we just put in, has been 186 weeks. So it's been the longest out of all the previous cycles, which in a way suggests that it's been the most different. And I would agree. I think it has been the most different. It's the first time we've had the post-halving peak above the pre and the minor bull run peak. It was also the longest bear run. It was also, we had kind of stilted peaks instead of just down peaks after the major bull run, where historically we've just gone straight down. Here we had a bit of a rally up. There's a lot of differences that happened with this last cycle. So to base what's going to happen now in the future off of this diverse data is going to guarantee you inaccuracy. Basically, it's not going to play out the same because it has a pattern of not playing out the same. With that said, what we've so far always seen is after the red peak, soon after the red peak, we do usually start our bull run. So there's a strong case to be made that in the next few weeks, the bull run might begin, end of February timeframe maybe. There's also a strong case that it just doesn't play out the same. There's no rule saying that it has to play out the same. Previously we've seen it go back down to this resistance, pretty close to this resistance after the post-halving peak. We're nowhere near this resistance at the moment, which is at $60. The low here was at 85. We could still see a strong drop. It's not off the table. Ultimately, if you want my opinion, I think it's not important what happens over the next 3 or 4 weeks. I think by the time it's February, Litecoin will have started to make moves up. And whether the strong moves up have started by then, I don't know. It might not even be February, it might be March. We can see historically, if we take a look at what time of the year these rallies started, oftentimes they were Q4 of the halving year. Here it started in April, but it also March, April timeframe. It could be another case of this. We look more similar to this first cycle / second cycle with how close the pre-halving peak was to the actual halving. There was about 2 weeks of a difference there. It was the same thing here. But again, that's not strong enough evidence to say that, because we had this, it's going to play out exactly like it did from there on. Ultimately, it's your call. But I do think in a few weeks, Litecoin will start to see good price action. Now, it's a new year, and I do believe in second chances, okay? But looking at the Litecoin Bitcoin chart, it makes me question my beliefs, because ever since Litecoin launched, it's only put in, and it's only done this, it's only put in lower highs and lower lows as time has gone on. And as it's the new year, I'm going to try and find some positive angles to talk about the Litecoin Bitcoin pair. But honestly, it's going to be a case of which is the least bad scenario. But look, if we take a look at kind of peak-to-peak measures, we can see that the pre-halving peak that we get with Litecoin, we often have our bull run peak quite a long time afterwards. And we can see this first halving, it took 96 weeks for us to put in our first peak, for us then to reach our second peak, again trading down the whole time. For our second halving, we can see our first peak to second peak, post-halving peak, took 111 weeks, so quite a big increase in time that we had to wait. Currently, depending if you count this as a peak, which there is a potential for, if you look at the peak last cycle, again, this was the 2021 bull run, we went up for about 4 or 5 weeks, and the total move that we made was 120%. If we take a look at what we're currently at, we can see that from the low to the high, we're at about 80%. You could argue diminishing returns for cycles. I would be mortified if this was the bull run for Litecoin against Bitcoin. Again, it's another reason why I say alt season isn't here yet, because we're just not seeing it on a lot of altcoin Bitcoin pairs. I personally think we will see Litecoin go higher. I think it will probably come up somewhere to this range, which is the 2000 sat range. We're currently at about 1000 sats. So from current price, I can see a 2x happening over the next year against Bitcoin. Now, if we take a look at the second cycle, where Litecoin had its bull run rally, I'll get rid of this flag, where we had this rally with Litecoin from the low to the high, we made 600% of a move against Bitcoin. This was also the year that Litecoin went from trading sub $10 up to $400 at its peak, or around 360. So naturally, it was going to reflect on the Bitcoin chart as well. I don't think we should expect any kind of crazy move like that. Litecoin's a much bigger cryptocurrency now. Its market cap is in the billions. I don't think you can expect Litecoin to 10x realistically from the current price. It's currently trading at $100. I think it will probably keep pace with Bitcoin. I think, again, maybe a 2x against Bitcoin over this time. The reason I say a 2x is because as the cycle's gone on, we can see that the drop Litecoin makes from cycle to cycle. First cycle, it was 50% of a drop from peak to peak. Second cycle, it was 70% of a drop from peak to peak. Here, this is currently showing 70%, but I think what this peak here is set as 60, which is the medium. I don't think, personally, we're going to come up to 3,000 sats. I think a 70% drop from peak to peak is, again, what's on the table. I think 2,000 sats is probably where we will top out for Litecoin this cycle. Good news is that historically, Litecoin either bottoms out against Bitcoin for the cycle, either very early on or at the very end. If Litecoin is able to at least hold the current price or even slowly trade up, I don't think we'll see the bottom out take place until the end of the year. We can see it was 37 weeks after the halving when we bottomed out back in 2017, 2016. If we take a look at how many weeks we're currently at, we can see that we're on our 36th. So realistically, if it was going to play out similarly, we'd be bottoming out any day now. Not saying that won't happen. If Bitcoin is going to make a move and break above 100k and sustainably stay above 100k, and Litecoin doesn't want to take part in that rally, that could be what brings Litecoin down into this range. Good news, of course, if it does bottom out, it has more space to go up to reach these highs. And just so you're aware, this is about 500 sats at the low, so it would be a 4x that Litecoin would make against Bitcoin if it went down to this 500 sat range and then rallied back up to the 2,000 sat range. Again, what does worry me is the amount of time that we often see from peak to peak for Litecoin. The fact that we are more or less slap bang in the middle of these two peaks currently from the previous peak back in November of 2022. And we're 106 weeks in, and that's when we've just got this new peak in December. It does worry me. Although, what kind of does reassure me is that if you take it from the halving to the peak, we can see it's oftentimes, here it was 43 weeks. Here, the second halving, it was 54 weeks. If you want to take sort of a medium from there, after the halving, we'll say it was 50 weeks. That would put us at end of March, end of Q1, beginning of Q2, when we'd get a peak for Litecoin against Bitcoin. So hopefully this isn't the peak, and potentially we might hit this 2,000 sat range by March, which would make sense because if Bitcoin's going to go to, say, $1,500, which is plus 50%, I think there's potential for Litecoin to reach $200 within that time frame before March. And if that is the case, that would be a 2x against Bitcoin. We would have reached that 2,000 sat range. Now, potentially we can keep rallying up again if Litecoin wants to go to its all-time highs and Bitcoin wants to do a 2x from here. You know, say Bitcoin tops out at 200,000, Litecoin tops out at 450,000. That's still roughly a 2x against Bitcoin. So it's still topping out at these 2,000 sats. It's whether Litecoin breaks past its previous all-time high in a dramatic way, going to $600, $700, and Bitcoin doesn't go any higher than $200,000. If that's the case, we will see Litecoin break this curse and move up to somewhere around 60% of a drop from peak to peak, which would fit the average of what we've seen. So there is potential for Litecoin to play out relatively bullishly against Bitcoin over the next 2-3 months. Ultimately though, we're just gonna have to wait and see. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, consider sharing with someone who might find it interesting. If you didn't, leave a dislike too, that's totally fine. Wishing you all the best for the new year to come, and hopefully see you soon in the next video. Take care and peace.